On July 4, 1776, the Second Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. Exactly 2 years later, on July 4, 1778, one of the westernmost actions in the war that was waged to secure the independence proclaimed by that document took place in Kaskaskia in the Illinois country. Virginia militiamen, led by George Rogers Clark, claimed Kaskaskia for the American cause without encountering any armed resistance. The French residents of the village, which had been under British rule for the past 13 years, announced the occasion by ringing the bell that King Louis XV of France had gifted to them in 1741. It became known as the Liberty Bell of the West. The process of national formation that encompassed both of those July 4th events led to the ratification of the Constitution of the United States. A stated goal of that Constitution was the achievement of a more perfect union. That phrase, a more perfect union, has held a variety of meanings for different people in different circumstances. What might it have meant then to residents of Kaskaskia who represented various ethnicities, cultural orientations, and socioeconomic statuses? What does it mean for us now? What's your conception of a more perfect union, and what traits would characterize it? To what extent does our society today resemble it or not resemble it? As we consider these important questions, the history of the place where the Liberty Bell of the West resounded, and the experiences of people who have lived there, give us much to contemplate. Now on to the story, which begins along the western bank of the Kaskaskia River, just above its confluence with the Mississippi. A group of Kaskaskia Indians and other Native Americans affiliated with the Illinois Confederacy arrived there in 1703 and decided to stay, probably because it seemed like home. Home had been the grand village of the Illinois, along the upper Illinois River, 230 miles northeast.
At its height, there was a population of roughly 20,000 people at this village site. And so this was a substantial population. By this point that we're talking about, the Illinois tribes were mostly focusing on agriculture, mostly maize agriculture, but also had beans and squash as well. And they were also hunting. And one of these patterns that we see over and over again is the summer bison hunts. There was a level of conflict that occurred with the Iroquois and other related groups. And this conflict came as a result of some of the economic advantages that the Peoria and the Kaskaskia were trying to assert. And one of these things that resulted in that was an attack on the Grand Village of the Kaskaskia. And in this attack, there was a large amount of women and children that were killed. And after that happened, the tribe was essentially had to move southward out of a necessity. And this also doesn't help that there's all these other groups, including the French, that are moving about in Illinois vying for political, economic, and power in general. And so all these different factors working together, you see the Kaskaskia and the Peoria and all the other sub-tribes moving to the southern region of Illinois that we now like to think of as the American Bottom.
The American Bottom, a 60-mile stretch of floodplain, adjoins the Mississippi River, bluffs, upland prairies, and timber. These varied ecosystems were conducive to the Kaskaskia's multiple subsistence practices. Accompanying them were several French Jesuits. Their relationship with the colonial French and the Catholic Church had begun about 30 years before. French traders started visiting the Grand Village to exchange goods with them. Jesuits visited too, establishing the mission of the Immaculate Conception. Many of the Kaskaskia adopted Christianity, perhaps following the example of the chief's daughter, Marie Rouenza. Rouenza was one of several devoutly Catholic women of the Kaskaskia tribe who married French traders, in her case a prominent one named Michel Acot, and persuaded them to temper their rowdy ways in favor of church, family, and community. Historian Robert Morrissey comments, The marriage created the kernel of an interracial Christian community around which an idiosyncratic colonial culture would soon develop. It was that idiosyncratic colonial culture that the nascent interracial Christian community carried, along with hope for reduced intertribal conflict, to the confluence of the Kaskaskia and Mississippi rivers in 1703. Word spread that this new village of Kaskaskia was an exceptionally good place to hunt, fish, and especially farm.
I think the thing that is most striking would be the resemblance of Kaskaskia to medieval French villages. That is, unlike the New England pattern, where you had a central village where people came to do business, but lived out on their farms, in the French villages, everyone lived in the village and went out to work on their fields. And the fields themselves looked very different. There would be a communal field fenced in. Now, they didn't farm communally. Each farmer owned certain strips in the field, generally so many arpents wide. An arpent was about 192 feet. Poor farmer might have a single arpent. A medium farmer maybe had 3 or 4 of them. A rich farmer maybe more. That doesn't sound like a lot of land, 192 feet, except it ran from the river all the way back to the bluffs, which could be well over a mile, a couple of miles even. And there was a good reason for these long lots, as they're called. When you're plowing, the most laborious part is turning the plow. You very frequently have to unhitch the animal, move the heavy plow around, rehitch the animal, and start again. So if you can plow for a mile, mile and a half without turning the plow, you're in good shape. Wheat was the big crop here, by the way.
Wheat was the big crop. The alluvial soil was ideal for it. Kaskaskia's mills produced tons upon tons of flour to be shipped down the Mississippi to New Orleans twice yearly, earning the area a reputation as the breadbasket of French America. The boatmen also transported vegetables, meat, and furs. On return trips, they carried manufactured and imported goods back to Kaskaskia. The village became a nexus of trade, some of it officially sanctioned, much of it not. Residents and visitors of every stripe exchanged items ranging from salt to furniture. Kaskaskia's success in agriculture and commerce made it prosperous. Even its least advantaged residents rarely experienced destitution, and many could afford ample possessions. The liveliness, complexity, and fluidity of the village's economy were mirrored in its social environment.
You have traders that have always been coming, and you have every kind of relationship that you would usually expect in an organization of multitudinous people. Except for the French government, there was never any kind of looking at the Indians as lesser people. In other areas, the Indians were quite separate from the European community, whereas there was intermarriage, of course, completely in here, and a lot of the people that continued to be very prominent in the society here were partly from Indian blood. There was never sort of there was later, but there was not really in the early days a strict separation between the French and the Indian.
Unlike many towns in French North America, Kaskaskia wasn't planned or planted by the colonial government. No official had instructed or even authorized the priests and roving traders to commingle with the Illinois Confederacy, migrate southwest, and start a village. They just did. In its formative years, Kaskaskia was mostly self-governing, relying on the Jesuits and Kaskaskia chiefs as authority figures. Representatives of the colonial government were too far away to stay in regular contact. They noticed, however, that although Kaskaskia's improvisational origin had complicated their plans, the village was bustling with activity, some of which was proving beneficial to the empire. So they felt obliged to incorporate it into the empire more fully. In 1718, the governor of Louisiana dispatched Pierre de Gueux de Boisbriand to the Illinois country to be its commandant. Boisbriand had Fort de Chartres constructed along the Mississippi, 17 miles upstream from Kaskaskia. There, he established a military unit and a civil government to administer Kaskaskia and other smaller villages in the surrounding territory. While facilitating the integration of those villages into the realm, he imposed segregation within one of them. Boisbriand directed the Native American residents of Kaskaskia to form a separate village several miles away. Why would the new commandant disrupt a community that seemed to be functioning harmoniously?
He had not lived with the people as the other French soldiers and inhabitants had. And this was the official behavior. So that's why he, separated them. It was not a good idea, but that's what else is new?
Generally, the Kaskaskia and the French were pretty good as far as getting along. However, there are certain differences that, can't be accounted for this time in the Anglo versus Native groups. And so one of those would be ceremonies that would take place, especially ceremonial dances. I imagine that the French would have come across these as very sacrilegious and to some extent anti-Christian. And so I imagine that was one of the motivating factors to having these separate villages of the native Kaskaskia portion and the Anglo-Kaskaskia village. Catholicism was extremely effective when it came to converting Kaskaskia and Peoria citizens, and not necessarily taking away those beliefs, but making it so that those beliefs are more of a working in tandem and secondary. And so one of the things of spirituality we see as an example is traditionally there are stories that can be told at various times of the year, but only one of those supernatural stories can only be told after the first chilling frost, or another way that was always told to me, when snakes stop going above ground, and essentially it's when the cold happens. And so these are the stories with the more supernatural tendencies, talking animals, folk heroes, spirits, things of that nature. And they would go hunt the bison, have that be a huge part of not only their subsistence, but who they are. We even see this in some things like some of the tanned hide works and hide robes that we see that were given to the French in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And those hides would have a huge culturally significant impact on those people. And so I think that's one of the big reasons that there's this more of a transient nature, and it's out of you don't just have your homestead and you farm year round and then you do it all again as it resets the next year.
The culture of French Kaskaskia also emphasized fellowship and fun. Its affluent residents enjoyed dressing up in fancy clothes and attending fancy parties, and those of all socioeconomic statuses enjoyed brandy, billiards, cards, stories, and fiddle tunes. Also, the Kaskaskia tribe's hope that intertribal conflict would cease went unfulfilled. Residents of Indian Kaskaskia endured violence inflicted by other Native American groups. Their conflict with the Fox was especially severe, sometimes involving mutual revenge attacks. Outbreaks of diseases, many imported by Europeans, also caused suffering and population loss. In the 1750s, The French and Indian War compelled Kaskaskia to ship much of its produce, along with some of its soldiers, up the Ohio River to support the war effort rather than down the Mississippi to be traded, disrupting the economy. For various reasons, the French government grew hostile toward the Jesuit order. The representatives of that order in Kaskaskia, who'd been central to the community from the beginning, were expelled in 1763. Robert Morrissey describes the complex social web that the Jesuits and many other people and groups had woven in the Illinois country as an empire by collaboration. He writes, "People in Illinois often made their collaborations consciously because they opportunistically saw compromise and working together as the best option for achieving goals. As a result, the imperialism that formed in Illinois was, in contrast to the typical themes of dysfunction and conflict, often characterized by compromise and flexibility, by diverse people purposefully acting to create a mutually acceptable order." When France ceded its territory east of the Mississippi to Britain at the conclusion of the French and Indian War in 1763, that mutually acceptable order came to an end. How nearly perfect a union was this empire by collaboration? Here's what one historian has to say.
They were far away from Canada when Canada was supposedly administering them. They were far away from Louisiana, and they could put up quite a bit of independence, particularly those who went out and hunted and fished. We talk about coeurs de bois, illegal hunters who didn't bother to take out licenses. And there were a lot of them. We even have an instance of kind of a mini revolt against the governor who was appointed, got into arguments with a number of the inhabitants, who sent a petition down to New Orleans saying, "Get rid of this jerk. He's not doing a good job." And by God, the people in New Orleans did exactly that. They demoted him, moved him out of the area, and put a new governor in. So there was, no, certainly not egalitarianism. The commander at Fort Duchart had a lot of power. But still, he had to reconcile himself to the people that formed the militia. They were not going to follow somebody who they thought was an idiot or an incompetent. We even have an instance of a fellow trying to stop the commandant of Fort Duchart in the middle of the road one day and sell him a bed, which turned out to be stolen. The fellow ended up in big trouble about that. Of course, there was a hierarchy of things, slaves on the bottom. Even in church, there was not exact social equality. One paid for one's pews, and the rich got the big pews up front, while the poor ended up with the pews in the back. If you had high enough status, you might even be buried within the church. People tended to want their daughters to marry people of at least equal social and economic status. So there was a hierarchy within society, as there is within ours today, more so than we like to admit.
The British assumed control of Kaskaskia in 1765. For a combination of reasons, most inhabitants of the community, both Native American and French, found Kaskaskia under the British regime to be a less mutually acceptable order than the one that preceded it. When Colonel Clark and Virginia militiamen claimed Kaskaskia for the incipient United States, some residents were cautiously optimistic about the prospects for a new mutually acceptable order. Following several tumultuous years, sometimes called the Virginian Anarchy, Kaskaskia joined the Northwest Territory and received an influx of Anglo-Americans. It became the capital of the Illinois Territory in 1809, then Illinois' first state capital from 1818 until 1820, when the capital moved to Vandalia. Under pressure from the federal government, the Kaskaskia tribe, whose population had declined because of conflict, disease, and related factors, officially relinquished almost all of its land in Illinois and migrated west in 1833. It persists today as a subtribe of the Peoria tribe of Indians of Oklahoma. We'll hear more about the Peoria tribe and its relationship to Kaskaskia later in the program. After a devastating flood in 1844, Kaskaskia lost its designation as the Randolph County seat to Chester. During the Civil War, Kaskaskia, like many communities located near the border between North and South, experienced significant internal division, but the turmoil within the community largely subsided when the war concluded. Despite the setbacks that it experienced, the town remained a commercial hub throughout the mid-19th century, benefiting from the steamboat trade, which unfortunately contributed toward its downfall. Steamboats required enormous quantities of wood to fuel their boilers. Consequently, riverbanks once crowded with timber were now bare and susceptible to severe erosion. Because of erosion, the Mississippi's channel immediately above Kaskaskia shifted eastward. Over the 1870s, it crept closer and closer to the Kaskaskia River, ebbing away at the shoreline just north of town. During a spring thaw in 1881, the Mississippi's current accumulated behind an ice jam in the resulting bend. Anticipating T.S. Eliot's description of it as a strong brown god, sullen, untamed, and intractable, the Mississippi pummeled through the narrow isthmus separating it from the Kaskaskia and flowed into the channel previously occupied by the last few miles of that river. The community now found itself marooned on an island between the old and new courses of the Father of Waters. Furthermore, because the Mississippi was so much larger and swifter than the Kaskaskia, whose former channel it now occupied, it began disintegrating the land on which the town was situated. Houses and buildings started collapsing into the river. It became obvious that the town couldn't survive much longer, at least not in its present and long-established location. Residents of Kaskaskia painstakingly dismantled Immaculate Conception Church and reconstructed it in the new location near the center of what was now Kaskaskia Island. They did the same with the old courthouse, which later housed a school. As the old town gradually crumbled into the Mississippi, many residents moved to nearby communities such as Chester, St. Genevieve, or St. Mary, Missouri. But some continued to live on the island, and latter-day Kaskaskia remained a functioning small town with various businesses and institutions. No roads lead directly from anywhere else in Illinois to Kaskaskia Island. To drive there, you have to cross the Mississippi to Missouri, presumably via the Chester Bridge, then travel across parts of Perry and St. Genevieve counties to St. Mary, Missouri, then drive across another bridge over the remnant channel of the Mississippi to reach the island. To some southwestern Illinoisans, the fact that Kaskaskia, despite its crucial role within the state's history, is now literally so marginalized from Illinois that one must leave Illinois to go there, symbolizes the degree to which such distant cities as Springfield and Chicago have eclipsed their region within the union that is our state. After the 1993 flood, the Diocese of Belleville considered dissolving the Church of the Immaculate Conception, but its parishioners persuaded the diocese otherwise. One of them, Mary Ellen Brown, told the Southern Illinoisan, "To a lot of folks, it's really important, because that's home still." The village of Kaskaskia is home still to about 25 residents, many of whom take turns serving as its public officials. What significance does Kaskaskia hold for descendants of its indigenous founders? What do their experiences, past and present, indicate about the pursuit of a more perfect union?
In the Omnibus Treaty of 1867 is when finally all those groups are given a choice of essentially you can go to Oklahoma or Indian Territory at the time and stay native, or you can become anglicized and stay in Kansas. And so the Peoria that exists today are all descended from that group that went down to Oklahoma in 1867. The Peoria is made up of 4 subtribes, and that is the Peoria, the Kaskaskia, the Piankashaw, and the Weah. And so the Kaskaskia is one of these subtribes that people still have a lot of identity to, and I know several tribal citizens who are very proud that their Kaskaskia lineage is what led them to be part of the larger Peoria tribe today. And you know, even as far back as we had a Chief Myers, he was a few generations ago now, but he was Kaskaskia lineage. And so each one of these various tribes has had leadership with the Peoria tribe. And that's one of the beautiful things about us coming together, as all of us had these cultural ties, this language, we feel like all the subtribes are represented in a good way in the Peoria today. Kaskaskia, and by extension St. Genevieve, which is there across the river, are one of those places that is, to an extent, the beginning of the end of that story of removal. And so it has a very special place in a lot of our hearts, and that's why we still talk about it to this day. I do know that the Cultural Preservation Department at the Peoria Tribe are doing a heck of a lot, and that includes coordinating stomp dances, coordinating powwows, as well as other cultural events. They have an active fish hatchery and a mussel program, which mussels will remain subsistence pattern for the Kaskaskia as well as the Peoria, and so they're still doing that to this day. In addition to that, they're consulting with local, state, and federal agencies on what's called National Historic Preservation Act, or Section 106. And so this requires these federal undertakings to contact the tribe and to work with them in a consultation effort if there's any ground disturbing activities that could potentially affect cultural resources which are vital to preservation for the tribe. The Cultural Preservation Department at the tribe is exceedingly busy with their revitalization effort for the language. So they, this summer, are doing their very first class for teaching the language to new citizens. And so it's not going to be something that's a specialized knowledge, but it's something that the tribe is trying to give to any tribal citizen with interest. And so that's fantastic, because the language was thought at one point to be essentially dead. And so this revitalization effort could potentially in the future create new speakers of the language. Think about the legacy that the Kaskaskia and all their related tribes have left in that area. Where you're walking is where they walked. And with that, you have a certain level of responsibility to your home and what was our home. And I hope that that is a legacy that will be protected, and people will keep talking about the history, and that the Kaskaskia tribe will never be forgotten in that region. But yeah, that's my main takeaway, is that I hope that our story is continued to be told for generations past me.
One component of life in Kaskaskia until the 1840s was slavery. In the community's formative years, members of the Illinois Confederacy tribes sometimes captured and enslaved members of other tribes. By the 1720s, Kaskaskia residents had begun using the labor of enslaved black people. According to some accounts, a prominent landowner imported several hundred enslaved Africans in 1724, but more recent scholarship indicates that the number was much smaller, on the order of 10 to 25. In any case, by the 1750s, enslaved black people comprised a third or more of Kaskaskia's population. Some had been intended to work in mining, and some might have been sent to labor in lead and silver mines across the Mississippi in present-day Missouri, but most worked in agriculture, especially the wheat farming that accounted for much of Kaskaskia's prosperity. Although the French Code Noir seems to have prevented some of the physical cruelty that people enslaved in many other places suffered, slavery in Kaskaskia, like slavery anywhere, was intrinsically unjust and inhumane. The Northwest Ordinance, and later the Illinois Constitution, officially outlawed slavery in most circumstances, but people who had practiced slavery under the French regime were allowed to continue. Additionally, some of the Anglo-Americans who migrated to Kaskaskia and its vicinity from the southeast in the early 19th century also practiced slavery, exploiting lax enforcement or legal loopholes, such as Illinois' indentured servitude policy, which allowed terms of indenture exceeding a typical human lifespan. Although slavery certainly wasn't as prevalent in Illinois as it was in the adjacent states of Missouri and Kentucky, it was considerably more common than Illinois' status as an officially free state might imply. Attitudes toward slavery among white residents of Randolph County, of which Kaskaskia was the county seat, varied widely. Some Randolph Countians strongly supported slavery, others actively opposed it. In the latter category were members of a particular branch of Reformed Presbyterianism known as Covenanters, who lived in or near Sparta and Eden. Many of these Covenanters were of Scots-Irish ethnicity and had migrated from upcountry South Carolina. Culturally, they resembled their fellow upland Southern migrants to Southern Illinois, but differed from many of them in that they vehemently opposed slavery in keeping with the tenets of their faith. Consequently, northeastern Randolph County became a site of anti-slavery and racial justice activity. As a result, significant numbers of African Americans moved to the area beginning in the first half of the 19th century. Evidence suggests that some of them likely were people who had been enslaved in historically French communities such as Kaskaskia or their descendants. Today, the Sparta area remains the place within Randolph County with the largest concentration of African Americans. The Randolph Society, founded in 2017, recognizes Randolph Countians who made valuable contributions to humanity, locally or beyond. Randolph Society honorees Nance Leggins Costley and John Willis Menard were African Americans from Kaskaskia whose accomplishments had a statewide and national impact. They were nominated by literary scholar and cultural historian Lauren Keena, a member of the Society's board of directors.
Nance Leggins was born in Kaskaskia in 1813. Her parents were indentured servants, essentially enslaved people in all but name, who lived in the household of a man named Thomas Cox. He ran a boarding house in Kaskaskia that actually was the place where the Territorial Assembly was meeting at the time. As the state capital then moved, she moved along with it, with the Cox family, so first to Vandalia and then to Springfield. But ultimately, when Thomas Cox fell on hard times, his creditors came after his entire estate, which included the people that he had indentured or enslaved. In 1827, Nance and her sister were sold in the only recorded public slave auction in the state of Illinois' history, in Springfield. But for Nance, she always had questions about the status of her freedom. She was really interested in trying to figure out if there were ways that she could reclaim the free status that she felt she held rightfully. So she looked to the court system to help her. In 1841, a young lawyer named Abraham Lincoln took her case and argued it before the state Supreme Court in Springfield and successfully helped to prove that Nance was indeed a free person. It's really important not only because of what it did for Nance and her family's legacy, but it also helped to set important precedents for people seeking freedom in the state of Illinois. She's one of my favorite figures to come out of Kaskaskia because you know that she paid such close attention to the topics of discussion that were swirling around her day after day. She really absorbed a lot of those lessons, and she had such courage to use them to help not only establish her own life of freedom, but a life of freedom for people who came after her as well. John Willis Menard was born in Kaskaskia in the 1830s. He was part of a family that included parents who were free people of color. He may have been a descendant of the French-Canadian Menard family who settled in Kaskaskia in the 1790s. He's probably most famous for the fact that he was the first African-American person who was elected to the United States Congress. After he grew up in Kaskaskia, he was educated in Sparta at the abolitionist schools there, and then went on to become a renowned writer and speaker, worked in the Lincoln administration, and then in 1868 was elected to Congress from the 2nd District in Louisiana. But unfortunately, as a sign of the times, he was denied his seat in Congress after his white opponent contested the election. He went and made a famous speech in front of the Chamber of House of Representatives in Washington, becoming the first African-American person to do that. But ultimately, the legislators decided to deny him his seat, and it was largely because of his race at the time. One of the things that John Willis Menard was hired to do by the Secretary of the Interior during the Lincoln administration was research the possibility of forming new colonial settlements for freed people who had formerly been enslaved in America. John Willis Menard was instrumental in researching the possibility of a colony in Belize, for example, in 1863. And he and Frederick Douglass really had differences of opinion about whether or not that was going to be a positive solution for emancipated people going forward after the Civil War. He was also a really talented poet and newspaper publisher, and I think that some of the writings that he has left behind give us such an interesting picture of what life was like for him and for his communities at that period of time.
This garden is an example of a kind of French heritage garden that travels all the way from Canada, from Quebec through Montreal, and as the French moved across the continent, they brought this gardening style with them. It is actually a garden of the 17th century style with raised beds, where everything is grown together, vegetables, fruits, herbs, surrounded by an orchard with beds for larger crops beyond, in this case a melon and squash and corn bed beyond, and then the whole thing would have had a chicken coop and shed, and everything in the house would have been included in stockade fencing, similar to what you can still see today down in St. Genevieve. This garden is approximately, the average lot size of a heritage garden was about a quarter to a half acre, and this garden is just about as big as what they would have had. What you see here are around the perimeter of the garden are espaliered 18th century variety apple trees, and there are wild grapes on the other side, which are what they were documented as making wine from and selling of the period. Everything in this garden has been researched as best it can be, but it's a fascinating journey to take to look at their foodways and see how some of these handed down recipes, where they come from, and to see their French roots, or sometimes native roots. There's a bread recipe handed down called the Prairie du Rocher bread, and I usually make it when we're here at the bake oven. And I had a Girl Scout troop of local Prairie du Rocher, so some of them are descendants of the people who made this bread, and I have them help me make it and show them how they would have made it in the 18th century. And that's a really neat connection.
Prairie du Rocher, population 500, observed its 300th anniversary in 2022. The celebration coincided with renewed interest in local French history and folkways. In 1974, much of the community and its vicinity joined the National Register of Historic Places as the French Colonial Historic District. Now, regional leaders hope to attain national park status for sites including the architecturally significant Creole House in Prairie du Rocher, the Pierre Menard Home, and portions of Fort Kaskaskia State Historic Site, which encompasses remnants of two fortifications that were smaller than Fort Deschartres but offered more immediate protection for Kaskaskia residents, as well as the historic Garrison Hill Cemetery. Senators Tammy Duckworth and Dick Durbin and Representative Mike Bost have introduced legislation to establish the Prairie du Rocher French Colonial National Historical Park. In addition to historic preservation, cultural sustainability, and tourism promotion, one impetus for pursuing a national park designation is the prospect of assistance in maintaining the levee that protects the Prairie du Rocher area from the fate that befell Kaskaskia in 1881.
We're hoping this time next year that becomes a reality. If it does, it actually opens the door to some federal funding, hopefully for the preservation of the area to do levee improvements, which we're in great need of. Basically, after Katrina hit in the Gulf, there was a lot of levee failures down south, and the Corps went in and did some evaluations and drew up, between the Corps and FEMA, they drew up some new criteria for levee certifications, and we became decertified not long after that. When you get decertified, you're officially in the floodplain. It raises your insurance rates. it's been about 10 to 20% on an annual basis. So yeah, we've got a lot of challenges that we face. And when I say costly, we're talking $100 million. And you know, we just don't have the taxing body for that kind of funding.
Lagioni is a song sung by the peasants that made a better life possible for the landowners. And so it's a begging song.
Let's see, I'm going to be 80, and I think I was young when I was about 7 or 8 years old.
We're carrying on a tradition that's been going on almost 300 years.
It wasn't a religion, but it was something that was dear to our parents. It was dear to our parents. That's what it was. And it was like a fulfillment of New Year's Eve.
Scholar Anna Servais writes, Lagiani is a ceremonial rite that belongs to a category of celebrations situated in the carnival calendar between All Saints' Day and Easter. In North America, urban and rural versions appear in various Francophone communities from the Caribbean to Canada. Thus, Lagiani is related to traditions such as rural Mardi Gras in Louisiana. In both, as Servais notes, performers travel to houses where they receive portions of food as payment for their performance, as nourishment for the impoverished of the community, or as provisions for a banquet at a ball. Currently, however, Prairie du Rocher and St. Genevieve are the only places where Lagiani specifically still occurs annually. Servais comments, being a creative expression of the identity of the communities of St. Genevieve and Prairie du Rocher, Lagiani transforms the space and the community from everyday life to a life between history and the present.
I'm English and German, but we always went to listen to them sing the Lagione. And I knew, pretty much about their singing. I listened to it since I was a little girl because my mom and dad always wanted to hear it sung. So I never dreamed I was going to learn it and to sing it. And I'm really happy about it.
When I came back then to Prairie du Rocher in '85, a lot of the people around town and so forth wanted me to go with them. The fiddle player was already 80, Bill Clare, and he said, somebody's going to have to start playing the fiddle. Well, I'd never played the fiddle at 50 years old. And so I started picking it up. And eventually I got to where I could play the Lagione on the fiddle. It's not near what it used to be because the younger generation does not participate, and also the older generation that felt it so significant are gone.
That's something we're very proud of. I'm not the only person that's nerding out about this. Like, everybody tonight was just scared because they want this tradition to be maintained.
And then there's a benediction that actually happens at the end in which the Capitan, or whoever, the guy carrying the biggest stick, as they're going house to house, they're tracking mud, they're knocking things over, and it's his job to get everybody out of the house. And so he says, "Nous en garde la compagnie, a demande pour nous excuser." at the end. So we're asking everybody, we please excuse us. Yeah, c'est fun faire quelque folie, c'est répondre des ennuis, and we're going to leave you alone at this point.
Dennis will return shortly to close out our program. First, though, let's take a moment to contemplate what the themes that we've discussed might indicate about the pursuit of a more perfect union. Kaskaskia's multi-layered history, involving multiple groups of people and many different social and political configurations. Kaskaskia's persistence as one of Illinois' smallest yet most historic municipalities, despite its being accessible only by way of Missouri, thanks to the dedication of its residents. The Peoria tribe's remarkable cultural sustainability initiatives in Oklahoma, as well as growing recognition of the Kaskaskia tribe's legacy here in Illinois. The progress in race relations that has occurred in southwestern Illinois since the 19th century, as well as the racial discrimination that still too often occurs. Challenges involving flood control and essential infrastructure that Prairie du Rocher, Kaskaskia, and many other small communities confront. Both the durability and the vulnerability of community-based traditions ranging from gardening to lagiani in the face of technological and economic change. The creative efforts of local people and organizations to promote virtuous cycles in which cultural conservation generates economic opportunity and economic opportunity incentivizes cultural conservation. All of these matters are complex and challenging, and their social and civic implications are subject to interpretation. For that very reason, they give us much on which to reflect as we consider how best to relate to our communities, state, and nation, as well as the natural environment and one another.
C'est tout. That's all there is.